Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Star Trek Voyager Season 4. This video is part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek Voyager, one season at a time. This video is where I cover Season 4 of Star Trek Voyager. So if you've seen my previous videos, you know Season 4 is one of my favorite seasons of Star Trek Voyager. I refer to it as a renaissance of Voyager, as I thought the first two seasons were great, but Season 3 was a disaster that nearly saw the downfall of the entire show. But then it came back with the season, which was just phenomenal turnaround. In fact, after rewatching Season 4 for this review, I have to say it's even better than what I remember, and I dare say it's probably my favorite season of the entire show. Now, the obvious change in Season 4 was a shake-up in cast as they introduced the new character of 7 of 9, while the character of Kes left the show. And with 7 of 9, they introduced the Borg as a staple villain of Voyager. Although they didn't have too many appearances in Season 4, they were referred to a lot because of 7 of 9, and thus became a regular staple of the show. And in my Season 3 review, I talked about how the show was under extreme pressure from the network or the studio to increase the sex appeal of the show, and this would often lead to the detriment of the show. However, in Season 4, they found a way to turn that pressure to their advantage by creating the character of 7 of 9, who, yes, has sex appeal, and yes, they dressed her in a skin-tight leotard in which the actress described as being so tight you could tell what she had for lunch. But 7 of 9 is also a very well thought out, very well constructed character with a full character arc, background, and traits that were fascinating to explore, which viewers wanted to see more of. Season 4 in particular highly benefited from exploring the arc of this character in her quest to fit in with Voyager crew. And this arc really worked from a storytelling perspective, and arguably it was the best and most consistent long-term story arc the show has ever done. But it wasn't just that they introduced 7 of 9, or just that they focused more on the Borg. Even if they hadn't have done those things, it was obvious that the overall quality of writing had just improved greatly. In Season 3, I talked about how they ruined Kes's character. However, judging by what they did with her in just a few episodes she appeared in this season, I have no doubt they could have redeemed her character had they kept her around. This season featured some of the best episodes and character stories in the show overall, regardless of who it was focused on. In fact, I would even go as far as to say to compare this season to Season 3 of The Next Generation in terms of the vast turnaround from bad writing to amazingly brilliant writing. So enough of the preamble, let me get more into the individual episodes of Season 4, starting with the premiere episode, Scorpion Part 2. I remember seeing an ad and the TV guide for this episode where it showed a huge picture of 7 of 9 as a Borg and had the headline that read, "Introducing 7 of 9. And when I saw this, I was frankly worried, as I feared the second part of the two-parter would go in a totally different direction and concern itself more with introducing this character rather than telling the conclusion of the story that was started in the Season 3 finale. Well, it turned out my fears were completely unjustified, as it was amazing how seamless they included the introduction of 7 of 9 into this conclusion, which very much concluded the story of Scorpion in a very satisfying way. It continued the same themes established in the first part, most notably the growing disagreement between Janeway and Chakotay, and how the rift between them grew even wider until they learned to work together in order to get through the toughest situation that Voyager has ever faced. Not only that, but the whole conflict between Species 8472 and the Borg was handled in a brilliant way, as Species 8472 were established as a threat to the entire galaxy, and had Voyager not helped the Borg defeat them, it is likely they could have conquered the entire galaxy, including the Alpha Quadrant. But at the same time, It's established that the Borg are the true aggressors in this war, and has committed to this alliance as Janeway was. She was smart enough to prepare for their eventual betrayal, and the way she teamed up with Chakotay to do it by appealing to 7 of 9's humanity was amazing storytelling. Overall, in my opinion, this is one of the best episodes of the entire show, and a prime example of Voyager at its absolute best. So after that, we get The Gift, which is a direct follow-up to Scorpion Part 2. In fact, some even consider Scorpion's Parts 1 and 2 and The Gift to form a three-parter of sorts. I'm not sure I'd go that far, as the story with the Borg war with Species 8472 ended in Scorpion, and this more deals with the aftermath. It's showing a stronger sense of continuity than Voyager had in the previous two seasons, and more so than it will again. Much in the way the episode Family dealt with the emotional consequences of the best of both worlds by showing the direct consequences of, it does the same thing here by showing the direct consequences of how severely 7 of 9's disconnection to the Borg has affected her. This episode decided to take a totally different tactic to that of the Next Generation episode I, Borg. Instead of treating the Borg like a lost, brainwashed child learning more about himself, the episode treated Seven's severance to the collective more like a heroin addict going through withdrawals, where she's just begging for another fix, but Janeway helps her through it by trying to show her how it would be better in the long run. And I love this interpretation. It was absolutely fascinating. It really earned bringing Seven onto the show as a new character rather than just plopping her in and giving her a Starfleet uniform, kind of like they did with, the Maquis. This was actually handled a lot better. And also on the subject of following through the consequences of Scorpion, this episode deals with Kes's telepathic encounter with Species 8472 having a huge impact on her, pushing her into another plane of existence. Now, logically, I know they used this as an excuse to write her off the show for budgetary reasons, as with the inclusion of introduction of 7 of 9, they had too many cast members which messed up their budget, so one of them had to go. However, the way they did it was amazing and really worked for the episode. They had Kes reconnect with her roots that she had lost in season 3 by exploring her telepathic abilities, her connection with Tuvok as a mentor, the Doctor as a teacher, and even giving her a touching scene with Neelix. And of course, her farewell with Janeway was absolutely heartwarming, extremely effective stuff. But this is why I said I felt they could have redeemed Kes's character had they kept her around, as the quality of writing was so much better overall. But all in all, this was an extremely powerful episode that served the purpose of introducing Seven, while at the same time farewelling Kes as well as it could have possibly been done. So next episode is Day of Honor, and honestly, whenever I think about this episode, I cringe, because I think of the main storyline with Paris and Torres stuck in space, where they admit they love each other, and at this point, I was like, yeah, no shit, because they are already been playing up this stupid romance between them for quite some time. When B'Elanna said, "I love you," I was like, shit. And that's probably what Tom should have said. And as I mentioned before, I never liked the Tom and B'Elanna relationship. I think that was a failure of the show, and it most certainly doesn't work in this episode. However, all of that being said, watching this episode again, I realized there's actually a lot more to this episode than that, and probably more poignant was the storyline with 7 of 9 learning to integrate into the crew, and this was actually handled extremely well. This is, after all, the first episode we see 7 of 9 trying to function as an active crew member, and explores how awkward this is for her, but that's she's actually putting in an effort. And I love how they meet a group of refugees whose world was destroyed by the Borg, and at first she doesn't care about them, but by the end of the episode she grows to have sympathy for them, and the episode really earned this. So in the end, I realized this episode isn't all that bad after all. It's just that one little plot with Tom and B'Elanna, which arguably is just a side plot, so this episode is actually okay. So after that, we get Nemesis, the episode, not the movie, and I did already do a full-length review for this episode. You can check that out for a more in-depth analysis, and that review was done as part of my episodes I love that everyone else seems to hate themed week. But I haven't really seen that much hate for this episode per se, more like an indifference, as this episode generally isn't viewed that highly and more often is dismissed as average or below average, and I completely disagree. I think this is one of the best episodes of the entire show, as it explores very serious issues of propaganda, indoctrination, and what it means to hate in very powerful and meaningful ways. And it does this through the use of one of the best twist endings ever pulled off in a Star Trek episode, but more than that, it perfectly explores Chakotay's character, who does get a bit neglected in future seasons, so this has always been, in my opinion, one of the best episodes of Voyager. So then after that, we get to Revulsion, which to be honest is a somewhat forgettable episode. Not an entirely bad one, but nothing really noteworthy either. The most noteworthy thing about this episode is the guest appearance by Leland Orser, who's very good at playing a sleazebag or someone who is mentally unstable. He plays a mentally unstable holographic murderer, and the plot goes pretty much as one would expect. So it's actually pretty average. However, yet again, the saving grace of the episode is the side plot with 7 of 9. Here we explore the crush Harry Kim has on her, which was an ongoing storyline at the start of season 4, but would later be abandoned. I'm actually disappointed that they gave up on this storyline later on, as I think they should have followed through with it, perhaps even going as far as to put Kim and 7 together. This was played out incredibly well here, as you get the combination of Kim having a very understandable physical attraction to 7 and trying to hide it, while 7 was completely unfamiliar and out of her element when it comes to social interactions. So Kim constantly tries to engage her in small talk and conversation, but she's kind of oblivious to it, and they did form a kind of connection in this episode, and the way it concludes with 7 just confronting Kim abruptly about wanting to copulate and completely missing the point of the social interactions was not only hilarious, but a very well done character moment as well. I'm very sorry that the storyline was abandoned. So after that, we got The Raven, which was a brilliant character story that explores the early integration of 7 into the crew. And I felt this episode in particular went leaps and bounds to explore her character. She thinks she's being called to the Borg Collective, but really she's being called to her human roots. And the scene where she's on the Raven and reliving the moment of her assimilation of when her parents were abducted was absolutely brilliant, and I thought it was played well that Tuvok was the one to walk her through this, as he viewed it from a logical perspective when really 7 was learning to reconnect with her emotional side. It was a very good contrast. And the side plot with the Bomar, a species that are highly paranoid and have a slew of ridiculous conditions for Voyager to pass through their space, added a nice touch to this episode as well. And the vision she had of the Raven, which was really her subconscious trying to remind her of the trauma that she suffered, was amazingly well done. The editing, the music, everything was just spooky. This is one of the most effective, powerful episodes in the entire show. So after that, we get Scientific Method, and I recently watched several negative reviews on this episode, and that surprised me because I always thought very highly of this episode. It may not be as powerful as the previous episode, but I found it a very effective and suspenseful episode that was executed very well, as from start to finish, it had me invested and engaged to see what would happen next. I love how you see the crew behaving strangely and getting sick, but you have no idea why, and then you learn along with the Doctor when he's discovered that there are cloaked aliens on board running scientific experiments on the crew that is harming and in some cases killing them. The way this plays out with the Doctor having to elicit 7 of 9's help, unbeknownst to the rest of the crew, was very engaging, and the final resolution where Janeway just flies straight into the pulsar to get rid of the aliens who think she's bluffing, but she wasn't, was awesome. Some may hold this against her and saying that she very well could have destroyed the ship, killing everyone, but I totally agree with her that that's preferable to just doing nothing where these arrogant aliens kill or deform most of the crew. So I actually quite like this episode. So next we come to Year of Hell. Those of you who have seen my top 10 Voyager episode video will know that this is my all-time favorite Voyager episode. As I've been outlining so far, Season 4 had a very high quality of writing and episodes. Even the bad episodes have things about them that I like, but to me, these are the crowning achievement of the quality of writing of Season 4, and one of the all-time best Star Trek episodes of any series. This two-parter encapsulates everything about good Star Trek you expect to see. An amazing guest star performance with Kurtwood Smith, whom I recognize as playing the villain in RoboCop and Fortress, but others may recognize him from some sitcom called That 70s Show or something. I never really watched it. Anyway, his performance as Anorex is absolutely brilliant, and I dare say the best performance by any supporting actor on Voyager. And on top of that, you have the kind of speculative sci-fi storytelling that Star Trek excels at, in this case a time ship that goes around eradicating entire species in order to change the timeline, in order to strengthen their empire. And Voyager gets caught in the middle of it, and the effect comes under constant attack to the point where Voyager is falling apart around them. The reason why this two-parter works so well is the character stories it tells, as you get great interactions between Chakotay and Janeway, between Kim and Taurus, between Tuvok and 709, between the Doctor and Tom Paris, and basically everyone. The scene where Janeway says goodbye to Tuvok right before the final battle, where she essentially intends to commit suicide, was absolutely heartbreaking, and it was done so brilliantly. The music, the writing, the acting, everything was just spot on, and it brings tears to my eyes every time I watch it. Now, I know some people hold it against this episode that it resets the timeline at the end of the episode, some claiming that it hits the reset button and thus erases all the character development explored in this episode, but I very strongly disagree and would argue the popular episode Yesterday's Enterprise does the exact same thing, and just like that, it also works in this episode, as although the characters don't retain any of the memory of these events, it shows that this is in their characters, and it's what they're capable of when faced with an impossible situation. Moreover, the way it ends with Anorex living happily ever after with his wife and talking about how he can make the time to spend with her was an absolutely amazing way to end the episode. In my mind, this is the perfect Star Trek two-parter and one of the absolute best stories ever told in all of Star Trek. So, next episode is Random Thoughts, which is kind of a disappointment following Year of Hell, but I guess not every episode can be pure gold, not even in Season 4. I heard someone recently refer to this episode as coming off as a first draft or not fully developed, and I agree. I see the beginning of an idea here, but it doesn't really seem to be fully realized. And honestly, I don't think this episode justified why it needed to exist. So after that, we get Concerning Flight, which, to be honest, I purposely avoided when this first came out because the concept of an entire episode about the Leonardo da Vinci hologram did not sound appealing at all to me. I always found holodeck episodes like this boring, and I had no particular interest in the Da Vinci hologram, but again, this episode wasn't quite as bad as I thought, as it involved a story of a group of alien pirates that steal Voyager's main computer, and thus they have to go on a mission to recover it, which was very interesting. And even the way they integrated the Da Vinci hologram by use of the mobile emitter was better than I thought it would be. That being said, this episode still wasn't that great, and got more ridiculous when it got into the Janeway having to work with Da Vinci to defeat the alien storyline, but still not a completely bad episode. Next episode is Mortal Coil, an episode I didn't even know existed until years after it came out, so I've actually only seen this one a couple of times. Previously, I didn't think much of it and actually thought it was rather boring. However, watching it again for this review, I actually learned to appreciate this episode a lot more, as there are few episodes that actually explore Neelix's character seriously instead of just treating him like the idiot comic relief. And although I did think Neelix's suicide attempt was a bit too extreme to be believable, I did really buy the crisis of faith that he suffered, and I love how this did dive deeper into his past as it was established in the episode Betrayal about the loss of his family and his desire to be with them again. That is something I did really buy. Plus, I love how Chakotay was his guide and helped walk him through this crisis of faith, and it was a great use of Chakotay, who was very underused in later seasons. Plus, this episode had some amazing dream sequences, like the one with Neelix's sister telling him the afterlife was bullshit and that she all of a sudden started talking like Naomi until she said, "Scared you," and then promptly just disintegrated in front of him. It was one of the most effectively creepy shit that I've ever seen. So I'm now convinced that this episode is actually really good. So next we come to Waking Moments, and this is an episode I always loved. It's interesting this episode came out before Inception. Had it come out after Inception, I would probably have accused it of ripping it off. But this is actually a really interesting concept of aliens invading the Voyager crew through their dreams, and it was absolutely fascinating. And like Scientific Method, this was really engaging and suspenseful episode through and through, and a well-constructed thrill ride. Having those creepy aliens just pop up in people's dreams was a nice touch, as was having Chakotay be the one who was able to figure everything out and remain awake, and having him confront the aliens was totally badass. So yet another example of how the writing in Season 4 was just top notch. So after that we get Message in a Bottle, and I don't want to take away from this episode because it was actually rather good, as the quirky interactions between the Doctor and the new EMH played by Andy Dick was actually really entertaining, and I did quite enjoy this episode. They had a kind of chemistry together that really worked on screen. But I often see this episode listed on top 10 best lists, and even listed among the top 5 highest rated episodes on IMDb, and frankly, I don't think it belongs there. This is a fun and entertaining episode, yes, but is it one of the best episodes of the whole show? In my opinion, not by a long shot. There's so many episodes better than this one, and this season alone, let alone the entire show. I mean, as fun as this episode was, the plot is kind of bland, and the reasons were never given on why the Romulans would take over a Starfleet ship, and it just came off as two-dimensional, evil cardboard villains. And what's really frustrating to me is the episode came out the same time Deep Space Nine was doing the Dominion War storyline. Now granted, I understand that Voyager wouldn't want to focus on the Dominion, as that's strictly a Deep Space Nine villain, and Voyager would want to have a more recognizable villain to cameo, but they could have used the Cardassians, who were allied with the Dominion, and thus also at war with the Federation, so it would have made perfect sense for the Cardassians to attack a Starfleet ship and take it over, and thus they could have easily tied this into the Dominion War. I mean, Voyager has already done the Cardassians before, as Seska was the Cardassian and the main villain of the first 2 seasons, so it would have been a nice callback to that as well. Having the Romulans in it made no sense, and was just a shameless attempt to appeal to Next Generation fans. So this episode was good, but not great, and very far from being one of the best episodes of the entire series. So next episode is Hunters. Now, this title I feel is very misleading, as it refers to the storyline with the Hirogen, which in fact is just the B plot. In fact, whenever I hear the title, I think, well, this episode isn't that good, because I just think of the Hirogen storyline, which was kind of bland, as it introduces this hunting type aliens that remind me of the Predators from the Predator movies, or the Tusk aliens from Deep Space Nine, but probably they're more like the Predators. But in In this episode, they came off as kind of generic. However, that's not really what the main focus of the episode is. It's actually more focused on the crew receiving letters from home, and this was an amazing character story. I think I had previously underestimated how powerful and well executed this story actually is. When I reviewed the first season episode, Eye of the Needle, I talked about how that episode was a one-of-a-kind character story that the show forgot later on, but I forgot about this episode, which is almost just as powerful as when the crew received letters from home, where Tuvok finds out that he's a grandfather, Janeway finds out that she's been dumped, Chakotay and B'Elanna find out that the Maquis have been wiped out, and Tom and Harry react differently to the prospect of receiving a letter from home, where Harry is desperate to get one, whereas Tom acts like he's indifferent, where really he's dreading what it might say. All amazing character stories. Hell, even the Tom and B'Elanna romance worked in this episode. Although I would say the episode is actually a bit tainted by the Hirogen storyline, because it shows that unlike in the first season where they can do an episode that is a straight out character story, in this season they had to interject some mediocre action scenes in order to spice it up. But still, it is a really good episode. So next episode is Prey. Now, I always liked this episode, but after rewatching it, it's even better than I remember, and I am now seriously considering this episode for my top 20 best episodes. It's an amazing episode, and in my opinion, the best appearance of the Hirogen, and it's the only decent episode that follows up on Species 8472. Tony Todd, most famous in Trek for playing Worf's brother Kern, and the future version of Jake Sisko, also does an amazing job as the Hirogen hunter hell-bent on killing Species L8472. At first, this episode begins as a high-tension, edge-of-your-seat episode as Voyager is at risk, first by the Hirogen, then by Species 8472, but then it turns into a very fascinating moral dilemma when they learn that the alien from Species 8472 is wounded and simply trying to get home, so they view what the Hirogen are doing to it as cruel. But 709, having a particular hatred and fear of Species 8472, disagrees and is in constant arguments with Janeway about what to do. And the thing is that it's not clear-cut who is in the right and who is in the wrong in this situation, as one could side with Janeway that it would be immoral to help the Hirogen hunt a defenseless and wounded creature who just wants to go home. But on the other hand, one could side with Seven that it would be foolish to risk the entire ship and the entire crew being killed against, because the odds are stacked against them, and the odds are that they would be destroyed by the Hirogen, and they do this in order to defend a member of a species that participated in an attempt to destroy all life in the galaxy. And I absolutely positively loved how this situation was resolved, as it was totally different than one might expect, therefore did an amazing job at subverting expectations, as 709 actually defies Janeway's orders and gives the Hirogen the Species 8472 alien. And this creates an extremely interesting and well-acted tension between Janeway and 709 that made for amazing character stories. So, all in all, this is simply an amazing episode. So the next episode is Retrospect, and this is another episode that I hadn't heard of until years after it came out. But unlike the other one, watching this episode again didn't make me appreciate it anymore. In fact, if anything, I think it's even worse of an episode. I don't really understand why it exists or what they were trying to do with this episode. It had some potential with like the arms dealer who was like really stuck up, but it never actually went anywhere that was worth going. It seems like another first draft that just got rushed before it was ready. I suppose it has a message, but to be honest, I don't know what that message is. Hypnosis is an unreliable source of information. Don't jump to making accusations without solid proof, or don't go insane and attack someone when they're trying to surrender to you. I'm not sure what the message is. I don't think that's my fault. I think that's the episode itself that doesn't really know what it's trying to say. So then we get to the killing game Now, this two-parter is pretty well liked, and I can see why. It's obvious they put a lot of effort into these episodes and were building them as this big, epic two-part event. Brennan Braga, who helped write this episode and was the producer involved in making this episode, even referred to it as one of his personal favorites. However, honestly, I don't really think much of this episode. In fact, on my rewatch, I identified this as like the turning point that the season started to lose a bit of quality, and frankly, it was a bit hard for me to get through this episode. I mean, I don't hate this episode, but I don't think it's all that good either. The plot of the episode is pretty far-fetched and just seems like an excuse to do a World War II storyline, as if there wasn't enough of those already. I read recently that this episode concept was written several years previous, and it had been revived this season when they came up with the idea to use the Hirogen for it. So really, the Hirogen were shoehorned into this story, and really it does feel that way when watching this episode. I mean, the thing about the Hirogen leader wanting to use the holodeck to simulate the hunt was plausible, but the part about him running, World War II simulations and erasing the crew's memories to make them think they were a part of the simulation was less so. In fact, the whole concept of the neural transmitters was ridiculous. I mean, why bother to convince the crew that they're part of the simulation? Why not just use holograms or otherwise force the crew to participate? And how did the Hirogen have this kind of technology to begin with? They're a species of hunters, not of people who erase people's minds and get them to think there's something else. This reeks of contrived writing in order to have the main cast play the part of those involved in World War II. And of course, to get 709 to sing. Another thing that really bothered me was that Voyager was occupied by an alien force for months, and they practically torn the ship apart. Janeway herself had described the damage to the ship as massive, and yet, the very next episode, Voyager's perfectly fine, as if nothing ever happened, and this season was really good at keeping continuity that is up to this point. But again, these episodes weren't terrible. There were some exciting and suspenseful moments at times, but overall I don't think they were all that remarkable. So next is Vis-a-Vis, which is another meh episode. Not terrible, but also not terribly interesting. About some alien stealing Tom's body and having to struggle to get it back. Of course, this episode is focused on the Tom and B'Elanna relationship, which is a huge minus for me right there. And the storyline with Tom being unhappy with his life on Voyager and acting like a bit of a jerk is nothing we haven't seen before, and nothing that we won't see again for that matter. But the storyline with the alien who can steal people's bodies was somewhat interesting, so it wasn't a terrible episode. So after that, we get the Omega directive. Ironically, what I remember most about this episode is that it came out the same week as the Deep Space Nine episode and the Pale Moonlight, and I watched them both for the first time back to back. Needless to say, this paled in comparison to In the Pale Moonlight, which is one of my all-time favorite Star Trek episodes for miniseries, so maybe that's why I never felt too highly about this episode. But watching it again, it's not bad. It's actually quite interesting. Where due to some top secret directive, Janeway goes off on some half-cocked important mission, and I love how Chakotay managed to talk her into telling the crew. Although one nitpick I have is when she told the senior staff, she says that, what she says here doesn't leave the room. And yet, B'Elanna Torres, who is the chief engineer and thus a vital part to such a mission, wasn't there, and Neelix was. Well, I guess it's important that he knew what to cook for that night. I don't know. Likely this had something to do with the actor's availability, but this just seems really off to me. But as for the storyline itself, it was fascinating that Seven had a somewhat spiritual connection to this molecule, which Janeway was hell-bent to destroy, so seeing the inner conflict that this brought up with Seven and how Janeway dealt with this did make for some good character moments, so it was an interesting episode, if not a great one. So next episode is Unforgettable, which the common and jest and joke about this is that the episode is actually forgettable. and it really is. This featured a guest appearance by B-movie star Virginia Madsen, whom I recognize from such gems, masterpiece films like Highlander Part 2 and The Candyman. However, she's actually a really good actress who went on to co-star in the Oscar-nominated film Sideways, and I thought she did a really good job here. I just found her presence a little distracting, but more than the writing of the episode wasn't that good. I mean, the concept was okay, I guess, but I wasn't really invested in the romance between Virginia Madsen and Chakotay, which was central to the story. Plus, the ending was so predictable. As soon as she mentioned the Tracers have a device that could wipe runaways' memories and make them want to return home, it was so obvious that that's what was going to happen to her. And when it did, Chakotay was talking about trying to convince her to stay, but it was so obvious that this wouldn't work, and sure enough, it didn't. I mean, maybe I would have been able to overlook the predictability if I was really invested in the character moments which evolved around Chakotay's romance, but I wasn't. In fact, when she was begging Chakotay to convince her to stay once she lost her memories, she should have known that it wouldn't have worked. What she really should have done is record a message to herself instead of trying to get Chakotay to do it. That would have made way more sense, but whatever. Overall, I'd hate to say it, but this was a forgettable episode. So, next episode is Living Witness, which is another fan favorite I see on a lot of top 10 lists, and for good reason. In fact, I would say this is the major exception to the later half of the fourth season not being as well done. I have done a full-length review for this episode as well if you want to see a more depth analysis, but suffice to say, I find this a very unique and risky episode that pays off in spades. In fact, that's one of the most accurate criticisms leveled at Voyager is that it tends not to take risks and play things safe, and that's why Voyager doesn't stand out as much. But this is an example of the show taking risks that totally pay off. In this case, it's by setting an episode 700 years into the future and having the only main character to appear in the present to be the Doctor, which is in fact just a backup system for the Doctor, so arguably not really the Doctor. And the rest of the crew only appear in hologram form from a historical perspective, which allowed the cast to play villains. And it was such a fresh and original way to show the darker side of the crew rather than doing the typical parallel universe storyline, which has been done to death in Star Trek. But what makes this episode really exceptional is the character story the Doctor goes on, as he makes the transformation from being appalled at seeing Voyager crew portrayed as villains to realizing what's more important is keeping the peace between these aliens who are about to break out into a race war. And the historian Quarren went through a similar character journey in questioning everything that he thought he knew about history, and I love how he and the Doctor ended up working together to stop a race war, and how their individual character journeys brought them together. It was just done so well. And the ending that jumped yet another 700 years into the future to show the people in the future looking back at the history about how the Doctor and Quarren changed their planet for the better was so touching. It brings tears to my eyes every time. And this episode has strong, effective themes about race relations, history, and how one should always keep an open mind. It was completely brilliant, and I agree, one of the best episodes of Voyager. But after that amazing episode, we get Daemon, a much more mediocre episode that wasn't quite as boring as I remember it. I do love episodes that in general deal with the issue of Voyager having limited resources, and then at times their power supply would become very dire. First of all, I have to mention, I absolutely hated, with a capital H, hated the B story with Neelix going to sickbay to sleep and the doctor being a dick to him because he wanted his privacy. The storyline was so juvenile and dumb I could barely stand it. But the main storyline with the demon planet duplicating Harry and Tom and wanting to duplicate the whole crew in order to evolve was somewhat interesting, enough to make this episode worth watching, even if it isn't all that great. So next comes One, and I was actually shocked to see that this is regarded as one of the better episodes of Voyager, as I never liked this episode. In fact, many times when making a short list for my least favorite episode, this episode would always come up. Watching it again though, I realized that it isn't that bad, as there are some interesting aspects to it, like the deadly nebula that would take years to go around, and the Doctor in 7 of 9 trying to get Voyager through where the ship and the Doctor keep malfunctioning. What I didn't like was the storyline with 7 being alone and dealing with loneliness and hallucinating some alien. Like, as soon as they revealed that this alien was a hallucination, I was like, okay, that's dumb. And the whole so-called suspenseful sequences of her going mad was not suspenseful at all and just cheesy. And in general, I find these kinds of stories with someone being alone in a big place for a long time, when they start to go a bit crazy, kind of boring, particularly when done on Star Trek. So I wouldn't say this is one of the worst episodes of Voyager, but it most definitely is not one of the best, and overall I'd say it's not really that good of an episode. So finally we come to the season finale, Hope and Fear, which is a rather bland finale for such an amazing season. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate this episode, but it's just okay. And such an amazing season should have had a better wrap-up. The premise is really interesting, where they think they're going to get home, but like always, it just turns out not to be the case, and that is a bit tiresome. But the bottom line is, I didn't buy the storyline with the alien who didn't actively seek out Voyager, who just sort of conned his way on board, and then just so happened to be asked to help with the message from the Alpha Quadrant, and was able to fake such a detailed and specific message, and he was able to effectively disguise an alien ship as a Starfleet ship, like every nook and cranny, all the little gadgets and gizmos look exactly like a Starfleet ship, and get every detail just right. I'm sorry, but if this guy had this much technology, he'd be capable of a lot more than this. And I don't buy his motivations at all. He blames Voyager for the Borg assimilating his world because they helped the Borg defeat species 8472. Come on, that's a bit far-fetched. He's going to blame them for stopping an even more powerful being that wanted to annihilate all life in the galaxy. And even if he did feel this way, he kept saying that they helped the Borg for their own selfish reasons, and all they wanted to do was to get home, which patently is not the case, and it completely ignores the threat from species 8472. Also, how the hell did he even know about this, which he obviously did before he went to Voyager, and yet these events happened thousands of light years away, as explained in the episode The Gift. So, not only does he have technology far, far superior to Voyager's and access to ships, and is able to fake a Starfleet ship so perfectly, and able to plan his con so perfectly, and able to know things that happen thousands of light years away from him, he's also incredibly obtuse and can't accept simple facts. However, I did really like that the character dynamic of 7 of 9 not wanting to return to Earth, but then giving the choice to return to the collective, she sides with Janeway and the Voyager crew instead. So as I said, I did enjoy this episode, I just don't think it was that great. The writing was too contrived and inconsistent, but the character story worked. So that's all the episodes of Season 4, so now let me name my favorite and least favorite episodes of Season 4. Starting with what is, in my opinion, the worst episode of Season 4. Now this was a hard choice, as the episodes in Season 4 weren't that bad. There were a few boring, mediocre episodes like Random Thoughts, Vis-a-Vis, Unforgettable, Daemon, and One, but for the worst episode of Season 4, I'll have to go with Retrospect. This is the one episode I think that simply does not belong in this great season, and it seems like it belongs more in a later season with lesser quality of writing, as this episode felt really half-assed and kind of pointless, so I definitely had to single it out as the low point for season 4. Now, as far as best episode, this was really tough too because there were so many amazing episodes this season. Scorpion Part 2, The Gift, Nemesis, The Raven, Hunters, Prey, Living Witness. But I think I'll have to go with what I still think is the best episode of the entire show and one of the best episodes in the entire Star Trek franchise, Year of Hell. Not only is this episode a fascinating sci-fi adventure story, but an amazing character story that explores a scenario where Voyager was constantly getting its ass kicked and what effect this would have on the crew and their interpersonal relationships. And it was just executed so well from start to finish, making it a unique standout in the entire Star Trek franchise. So as for my rating out of 10 for Season 4 as a whole, after much thought, I'm going to have to give Season 4 a 10, the best. Even though it's not a perfect season, it's as near perfect as a 26 episode season could get. I mean, even the bad episodes weren't that bad and had positives to them. And there were just so many amazing top-notch episodes this year. I was blown away by the consistent quality of writing as they kept turning out amazing episode after amazing episode. Plus, this season had a strong sense of continuity, something most other seasons of Voyager lack, and the rest of the seasons will continue to lack. I can confidently say, after rewatching this season, that Season 4 is the best season of Star Trek Voyager. So that's it for my review of Star Trek Voyager Season 4. I'll be back in roughly a month for my review of Season 5, and I'll continue to cover Star Trek, including a series of videos where I review episodes as requested by my viewers. And I also cover many other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Discovery, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.